Hello, my friend. To fully enjoy this beautiful and soothing story, gently close your lovely eyes. The first light of October slipped quietly across the hills surrounding Maple Hollow, painting the rooftops in soft shades of amber and gold. Thin ribbons of morning mist drifted above the Maple River, while the town slowly awakened to another peaceful day. Maple Hollow was the kind of place that rarely appeared on maps people carried in their cars. Travelers often passed nearby without ever realizing it existed. Yet for those who lived there, it was more than a town. It was home. The streets were narrow and lined with maple trees that had stood for generations. Every autumn, their leaves transformed into brilliant shades of crimson, orange, and yellow, covering sidewalks with a gentle carpet that rustled beneath every step. The bakery on Willow Street always opened before sunrise. The library's old clock chimed every hour without fail. Children walked to school along quiet sidewalks, waving to neighbors who already knew their names. Nothing in Maple Hollow ever seemed rushed. Even time itself appeared to move a little slower. Near the center of town stood one of its oldest buildings, the Maple Hollow Post Office. It was a modest red brick building with white wooden windows and a bronze bell hanging above the entrance. The paint had faded over the years, but every scratch and weathered corner carried stories that no history book had ever recorded. For nearly a century, thousands of letters had passed through those doors. Some carried wonderful news. Some delivered heartbreaking farewells. Others simply reminded people that someone, somewhere, was thinking about them. Every envelope held a small piece of someone's life. Long before sunrise, a familiar figure appeared at the front steps. Arthur Bell. At 69 years old, Arthur had spent almost his entire adult life inside this building. For 45 years, he had sorted letters, stamped envelopes, greeted neighbors, and quietly witnessed countless moments that shaped the town's history. Most people remembered birthdays by calendars. Arthur remembered them by handwriting. He could recognize many residents simply by looking at an envelope. Mrs. Margaret Ellis preferred neat blue ink. Daniel Harper always wrote in thick black letters. Clara Bennett's handwriting leaned slightly to the right, elegant and patient, just like the woman herself. Arthur smiled every time he noticed those familiar details. To him, handwriting was like a person's voice, unique, honest, impossible to replace. He unlocked the front door with the same brass key he had carried for decades. The lock clicked softly. The scent of old paper, polished wood, and fresh coffee welcomed him like an old friend. He switched on the lights one by one. Nothing had changed. The rows of mailboxes, the polished wooden counter, the brass scales, the sorting shelves, everything stood exactly where it had always been. Arthur preferred it that way. He hung his grey coat beside the office door and quietly brewed a small pot of coffee before beginning his morning routine. Outside, sunlight slowly filled the streets. Inside, the first letters of the day waited patiently. Arthur gently picked up the first envelope from the sorting table. He didn't rush. He never had. Every letter deserved a moment of care, because somewhere, someone was waiting for it. As he worked, the front door opened with its familiar little bell. "Morning, Arthur." It was Clara Bennett. She carried 2 books under one arm and a warm paper bag from the bakery. "You still arrive before everyone else," she said with a smile. Arthur chuckled. "I've been trying to break that habit for 45 years. And have you succeeded? Not even once. Clara laughed softly before placing the paper bag on the counter. I brought your favorite cinnamon rolls. Arthur looked almost embarrassed. You didn't have to. I know, Clara replied, but I wanted to. They shared breakfast in the quiet lobby before the town became busy. It had become an unspoken tradition over the years. No invitations, no schedule. It simply happened. For a few peaceful minutes, they spoke about the changing leaves, the coming winter, and the annual harvest festival that would arrive later that month. Neither of them mentioned the calendar hanging behind Arthur's desk. There was no need. Both already knew what it said. 6 days until retirement. Arthur occasionally glanced toward it without saying a word. 45 years, reduced to 6 small squares. He wasn't afraid of retirement. He simply wasn't sure who he would become without the post office. Outside, bicycles rolled past the windows. Children laughed on their way to school. The town continued exactly as it always had. Yet Arthur couldn't shake the feeling that something was quietly changing. Not only for him, but for Maple Hollow itself. Late that morning, Noah Carter arrived carrying 2 canvas mailbags over his shoulders. Unlike Arthur, Noah was young, energetic, and fascinated by technology. He often joked that one day, drones would deliver every package in America. Arthur usually smiled and replied with the same answer. Perhaps. But a machine will never know when someone needs a kind word along with their letter. Noah had laughed the first dozen times. Eventually, he stopped arguing. Deep down, he knew Arthur might be right. Because in Maple Hollow, delivering mail had never been only about envelopes. Sometimes it meant checking on an elderly neighbor. Sometimes it meant helping carry groceries. Sometimes it simply meant listening for 5 quiet minutes. People trusted Arthur, not because he wore a postal uniform, because he remembered them. By lunchtime, sunlight streamed through the old windows, filling the lobby with a warm golden glow. Arthur paused beside the sorting shelves. His eyes wandered slowly across every corner of the building. The worn wooden floor, the faded photographs on the wall, the old brass clock that had ticked faithfully for decades. He realized something surprising. He knew every sound this building made, every creaking floorboard, every cabinet hinge, every window that rattled during winter winds. It felt less like a workplace, more like an old friend. And soon, he would have to say goodbye. Arthur didn't know it yet. Hidden somewhere beneath this quiet building rested a forgotten collection of letters. Letters that had waited silently for decades. Letters that would soon begin changing lives. One envelope at a time. The afternoon settled gently over Maple Hollow. Sunlight filtered through the maple trees, scattering golden patterns across the sidewalks. A cool breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves, fresh bread from the bakery, and wood smoke rising from distant chimneys. It was the kind of afternoon that invited people to slow down, even if only for a little while. Inside the post office, the pace remained steady. Arthur Bell stood behind the sorting table, carefully placing envelopes into their proper bins. His hands moved with quiet confidence, guided by habits built over 45 years. He never looked hurried. To Arthur, every letter represented a promise that someone had taken the time to write, a promise that someone else was waiting to receive. The front door opened again. This time, an elderly woman stepped inside, carrying a small bundle wrapped in brown paper. "Good afternoon, Arthur." Arthur looked up and smiled warmly. "Margaret? It's nice to see you." Margaret Ellis had lived in Maple Hollow longer than almost anyone else. At 78, she still preferred walking through town instead of driving. "I need to mail this to my grandson," she said, placing the parcel on the counter. Arthur weighed the package carefully. "Is he still in Seattle?" Margaret nodded. "He starts his first teaching job next week." Arthur smiled. "He'll do well." "You always say that?" "Because it's usually true." Margaret laughed softly. "That's one thing I'll miss after you retire." Arthur looked down for a moment. "I'll miss these conversations too." After she left, the post office grew quiet once again. Only the steady ticking of the old wall clock filled the room. Arthur glanced toward the rows of brass mailboxes lining one wall. Most were still in daily use. Some hadn't been opened in years. He often wondered why their owners never closed the accounts. Perhaps they hoped one more letter might arrive someday. Hope had a way of lingering in places like Maple Hollow. Near closing time, Noah approached Arthur with a clipboard. The regional office called. Arthur looked up. "They're sending a team next Monday." Arthur already knew why. "They're coming to inventory everything before the renovation." Noah nodded. "They said we should clear the storage rooms this week." Arthur sighed quietly. The storage rooms. He hadn't opened some of them in years. Old shelves, broken furniture, boxes of outdated forms, equipment that belonged to another era. "I suppose it's finally time," Arthur said. After the last customer left, Arthur locked the front door. The familiar bronze bell gave one final chime for the day. He switched off most of the lights, leaving only those above the main counter, glowing softly. Outside, evening settled across Maple Hollow. Streetlights flickered on one by one. Their warm yellow light reflected gently on the quiet sidewalks. Arthur picked up an old ring of keys from his desk. Some keys were polished from decades of use. Others looked almost new, simply because they had been forgotten. He studied them for a moment. "There you are," he whispered. One small iron key. It carried no label. He couldn't remember the last time he had used it. Noah returned from the back office carrying a flashlight. "Ready?" Arthur smiled. "As ready as I'll ever be." Together, they walked down a narrow hallway that few visitors had ever seen. The walls were lined with faded photographs of former postmasters. Some pictures were nearly 100 years old. Men and women stood proudly beside mail wagons, bicycles, and early delivery trucks. Each had served Maple Hollow in their own time. Arthur slowed as he passed them. It felt almost like walking beside old friends. At the end of the hallway stood a heavy wooden door. Dust covered its frame. Arthur inserted the small iron key. For a moment, it refused to turn. Then, click. The lock opened. The door creaked inward. A cool breath of stale air drifted out. Noah shined the flashlight inside. Rows of forgotten shelves appeared from the darkness. Old canvas mailbags, broken wooden crates, rusted filing cabinets, stacks of yellowed newspapers. Everything had remained untouched for years. "It's like stepping into another century," Noah whispered. Arthur nodded. "In some ways, it is." They began sorting through the room. Most boxes contained ordinary things: old calendars, outdated postal forms, retired signs, worn uniforms. Nothing remarkable. Hours passed quietly. Dust floated through the narrow beam of Noah's flashlight. The only sounds were cardboard boxes sliding across the floor, and the occasional creak of aging wood. Eventually, Noah stretched his back. I didn't know one building could collect this much history. Arthur smiled. History doesn't disappear. It just waits until someone opens the right door. Noah paused. I like that. Arthur simply returned to his work. Near the far corner of the room stood a tall wooden bookshelf. Unlike everything else, it seemed unusually clean, almost as if someone had dusted it years after the rest of the room had been forgotten. Arthur frowned. That's strange. What is? I don't remember this shelf being here. Together, they walked closer. The shelf was solid oak. Its lower section rested directly against the stone wall. Arthur placed one hand against it. Something felt different. The shelf moved, only slightly, but enough to notice. Noah looked surprised. Did you just... Arthur nodded slowly. I think this shelf isn't attached to the wall. They pushed together. With a deep wooden groan, the bookshelf shifted several inches. Behind it, a narrow doorway appeared. Neither of them spoke. The opening was barely wide enough for one person. Darkness filled the space beyond. Noah lifted the flashlight. I've worked here 3 years. I never knew this was here. Arthur stared silently into the darkness. Neither had he. Some secrets had been hidden so well that even time had forgotten them. And somewhere beyond that doorway, something had been waiting, patiently and silently, for decades. Neither Arthur nor Noah moved for several seconds. The narrow doorway stood silently behind the old bookshelf, as though it had been waiting for someone to notice it again. Noah raised the flashlight a little higher. You really didn't know this was here? Arthur slowly shook his head. I've worked in this building for 45 years. He smiled faintly. And today, it surprises me for the very first time. The beam of light disappeared into the darkness. A few stone steps led downward. They were old, much older than the rest of the building. Arthur rested one hand against the stone wall. It felt cool and slightly damp. This part wasn't built with the post office, he said quietly. It must have belonged to an older structure. Noah looked at him. Should we call someone? Arthur thought for a moment. If this is unsafe, we'll leave immediately. He picked up an old lantern from a nearby shelf. To his surprise, it still worked after Noah lit it. Its warm glow spread softly across the narrow staircase. Step by step, they descended. The air grew cooler. The sounds of the town slowly disappeared until only their footsteps remained. At the bottom of the stairs, they entered a small stone room. It wasn't large. Just enough space for a few shelves and a wooden table. Dust covered nearly everything. Spider webs stretched between the corners. The room had clearly been untouched for many years. Noah swept the flashlight across the walls. I can't believe this place exists. Arthur noticed something carved into one of the wooden beams. 1918, he traced the numbers gently with his fingertips. So this room has been here for more than 100 years. Against one wall stood several wooden crates. Most were empty. One held old glass ink bottles. Another contained rusted brass stamps that had long since gone out of use. On the table lay a faded leather ledger. Arthur opened it carefully. The pages were fragile. Names, dates, addresses, records of mail deliveries from another generation. The handwriting was beautiful. Every line had been written with remarkable care. Noah looked over Arthur's shoulder. Can you read the signature? Arthur adjusted the lantern. After a moment, he smiled. I can. At the bottom of the page was a single name. William Ashcroft. William Ashcroft. William Ashcroft. Arthur recognized it immediately. The oldest photograph in the hallway. The postmaster from long ago? Arthur nodded. He served this town nearly 60 years before I arrived. Noah looked around the room again. It feels strange. What does? It doesn't look abandoned. Arthur looked up. What do you mean? The room is dusty. Noah paused. But everything is still organized. Arthur noticed it too. The ledger rested neatly in the center of the table. The ink bottles stood in perfect rows. Even the empty crates had been stacked carefully. It didn't feel forgotten. It felt preserved, as though someone had closed the door, expecting another person to return one day. Arthur continued searching. Near the back wall stood a large wooden cabinet. Its doors were swollen with age. Together they pulled them open. Inside were dozens of cloth mail sacks. Each one carried an old postal seal. Most were empty. Arthur checked them one by one. Nothing. Nothing. Still nothing. Noah smiled. Maybe we've discovered the world's oldest storage closet. Arthur laughed quietly. Perhaps. He reached for the final sack. It felt different. Heavier. Much heavier. Arthur untied the faded rope. Inside, bundles of letters perfectly tied together with cloth ribbon. Noah stared in disbelief. Those are actual letters. Arthur carefully lifted one bundle onto the table. The envelopes had yellowed with age, but they remained remarkably well preserved. No tears, no water damage, almost as though they had been protected from time itself. Neither man spoke. Arthur slowly untied the ribbon. The first envelope rested on top, a handwritten address, a familiar street, Maple Street. Arthur frowned. That street still exists? Noah looked closer. So does this house number. Arthur turned the envelope over. No postage mark, no return address. Only one sentence written neatly across the back. Deliver when the time is right. Silence filled the room. Noah looked at Arthur. What does that mean? Arthur didn't answer, because he didn't know. He carefully opened another bundle. More letters, different names, different handwriting, different years. Each one addressed to someone in Maple Hollow. Each one neatly wrapped. Each one never delivered. Arthur's heartbeat quickened. Not from fear, from confusion. This isn't possible. Noah looked puzzled. Why? Arthur gently placed another envelope on the table. If these letters were never delivered, why weren't they returned? Postal rules had always been clear. Undelivered mail was never stored for decades without explanation. Something about this collection made no sense. Arthur counted quickly. One bundle, then another, then another. There were far more than he expected. Perhaps 50 letters, maybe more. Everyone waiting, everyone silent, everyone carrying a story that had never reached its destination. Arthur picked up the leather ledger again. This time he turned to the final pages. Most were blank, until the very last sheet. Only a single handwritten sentence appeared there. No date, no explanation. Just one line, written in the same elegant handwriting. Some letters arrive exactly when they are needed, not when they are written. William Ashcroft. Arthur read the sentence twice. Then a third time. Noah looked at him. Do you think he wrote that? I believe he did. But why? Arthur slowly closed the ledger. I don't know. Outside, somewhere above them, the old clock in the post office struck 7. Its distant chime echoed faintly through the stone room. Arthur looked once more at the bundles of forgotten letters. For 45 years he had believed every piece of mail that entered Maple Hollow eventually found its destination. Tonight, that belief had begun to change. And without realizing it, Arthur had just uncovered the first piece of a mystery that had been waiting patiently for more than half a century. Arthur stood quietly, his eyes resting on the bundles of forgotten letters. The room had fallen completely silent. Even Noah, who usually had a question ready for everything, couldn't find the right words. The lantern flickered gently on the old wooden table, casting long shadows across the stone walls. Arthur carefully picked up the first bundle again. The ribbon had faded from deep blue to pale grey over the years, but the knot remained firm. Whoever had tied it had expected it to stay closed for a very long time. Noah broke the silence. "What should we do?" Arthur didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked around the room once more, trying to understand why someone would hide letters instead of delivering them. Nothing suggested carelessness. Nothing suggested theft. Everything had been arranged with remarkable respect. It didn't feel like someone had abandoned these letters. It felt like someone had protected them. Arthur selected one envelope from the top of the pile. He held it gently beneath the lantern. The paper had yellowed with age, but the handwriting remained beautifully clear. The letter was addressed to Mrs. Eleanor Pierce, 18 Maple Street, Maple Hollow. Arthur searched his memory. The name sounded familiar. Not because he had met her, but because he had seen it before. Years ago, in an old cemetery on the northern edge of town. Eleanor Pierce had passed away decades earlier. Arthur quietly returned the letter to its place. "We're too late," Noah said softly. Arthur nodded. For her, he paused. But perhaps not for everyone connected to her. Noah looked puzzled. Arthur smiled faintly. Letters don't always belong to only one person. They examined a few more envelopes without opening them. Some names were unfamiliar. Others still appeared on mailboxes around town. Arthur stopped when he recognized another surname. Harper. Daniel Harper, the local carpenter. The envelope, however, was addressed to Thomas Harper. Arthur remembered hearing that name many years ago. Thomas had been Daniel's grandfather. Arthur looked thoughtful. Families stay, no matter how many years pass. Noah nodded. So these letters might still matter. Exactly. Arthur gently placed every bundle back inside the mail sack. He tied the ribbon around the opening exactly as he had found it. No matter what these letters contained, they deserved to be handled with care. Noah watched him. "You treat them like they're priceless." Arthur smiled. "To someone, they probably are." Before leaving, Arthur walked once around the room. Near the doorway, something caught his attention. A small brass plaque had been attached to the wall. Most of its surface had darkened with age. Arthur wiped away the dust with his hand. Slowly, the engraved words became visible. "Private Records Room, Authorized Personnel." Only below those words was a much smaller line, almost impossible to read. Arthur leaned closer. "Until every letter finds its owner." Neither man spoke. The sentence hung quietly in the still air. Arthur looked back at the hidden mail sack, then at the old ledger, then once again at the plaque. 3 separate discoveries. Yet, somehow, they all seemed connected. Noah finally whispered, "Do you think that's where the town's saying came from?" Arthur frowned. "What saying?" "You've heard it? In Maple Hollow, every letter finds its owner." Arthur had heard those words many times growing up. People said them almost like a local tradition. No one ever explained where the phrase had begun. Most simply smiled and repeated it. Arthur had never questioned it. Until now. For the first time in his life, he wondered whether it had always been more than just an old saying. They climbed the stone staircase slowly. Arthur carried the lantern. Noah carried the leather ledger. Neither spoke until they reached the hallway above. Arthur looked back one last time. He gently closed the hidden door. Together they pushed the heavy bookshelf into its original position. From the hallway, there was no sign that a secret room existed behind it. Only they knew. At least for now. Back in the main post office, the familiar surroundings suddenly felt different. The wooden counter, the rows of mailboxes, the brass scales. Everything looked exactly as it had that morning. Yet Arthur no longer saw the building in the same way. For 45 years, he had believed he knew every corner of this place. Tonight had proven otherwise. Arthur locked the front door before stepping outside. The town had already settled into evening. Warm lights glowed behind the windows of nearby homes. The bakery had closed. The library stood dark and quiet. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed through the valley. Maple Hollow looked as peaceful as ever. No one walking those quiet streets could have guessed that, beneath the old post office, dozens of forgotten letters had been waiting in silence for decades. Arthur stood on the front steps for a long moment. The cool October air brushed past him. He looked across the quiet town. Then he whispered to himself, "Tomorrow. We begin?" He didn't yet know how. He didn't yet know why those letters had been hidden. And he certainly didn't know that the very first letter he chose would reopen a story that Maple Hollow had quietly carried for more than 50 years. The answers weren't waiting in the hidden room anymore. They were waiting somewhere in the town itself. And Arthur had only 6 days left before retirement to uncover them. Arthur Bell slept very little that night. The old leather ledger rested on the dining table beside an untouched cup of tea. He had opened it several times before going to bed, reading the same handwritten sentence again and again. Some letters arrive exactly when they are needed, not when they are written. It wasn't the sentence itself that troubled him. It was the man who had written it. William Ashcroft had served as Maple Hollow's postmaster more than half a century before Arthur first walked through the post office doors. Arthur had seen his photograph countless times hanging in the hallway, yet no one had ever spoken much about him. Like many people from another generation, his name had slowly faded into the town's quiet history. Outside, rain began to fall just before dawn. Not a heavy storm, just a gentle October rain that tapped softly against the windows and rooftops. Arthur stood by the kitchen window, watching tiny ripples spread across the puddles forming in his garden. Normally, mornings like this brought him peace. Today, they brought questions. Who had hidden those letters? Why had they never been delivered? And why had William Ashcroft left behind only a single sentence instead of an explanation? At 7 o'clock, Arthur locked his front door and started the familiar walk toward the post office. He could have driven. Almost everyone did these days. But walking allowed him to notice things most people overlooked. The florist was arranging fresh chrysanthemums outside her shop. Mr. Collins was sweeping the front steps of the grocery store. A young father held his daughter's hand as they crossed the street toward school. small moments, ordinary moments. Arthur believed they were the moments that truly held a town together. As he reached the town square, the rain had almost stopped. The bronze bell above the post office door gave its familiar chime as he stepped inside. For a brief second, everything felt normal again. The scent of paper, the polished wooden floor, the quiet ticking of the wall clock. Then his eyes drifted toward the hallway leading to the storage room. He knew what lay hidden beyond it. And suddenly, the building didn't feel quite the same. Noah arrived a few minutes later, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "I thought you might need this." Arthur accepted one with a grateful smile. "I probably do. You didn't sleep much, did you?" Arthur laughed softly. "Is it that obvious? You've sorted the same stack of envelopes twice." Arthur looked down. Noah was right. He had been distracted. For perhaps the first time in 45 years. Just before 10 o'clock, the front door opened once again. Clara Bennett stepped inside, carrying a canvas bag filled with returned library books. She paused as soon as she saw Arthur. "You look like you've spent the night solving a puzzle." Arthur smiled. "Maybe I have." Clara knew that smile well. Whenever Arthur answered a question without really answering it, something unusual had happened. She waited until the last customer left before speaking again. "Would you like to tell me about it?" Arthur looked toward Noah, then back to Clara. "After lunch. I'll meet you at the library." The Maple Hollow Public Library stood only a short walk from the post office. It was nearly as old as the town itself. Tall oak shelves stretched from floor to ceiling. Sunlight filtered through stained glass windows, painting quiet patches of color across the wooden floor. The smell of old books mixed with the scent of polished cedar. For Clara, it was the heart of Maple Hollow. If the post office carried the town's messages, the library carried its memories. Arthur arrived just after 1 o'clock. Clara was already waiting near a large table covered with local history books, newspaper clippings, and several worn leather journals. She looked up with a gentle smile. "I had a feeling we'd be meeting here today." Arthur chuckled. "So did I." He reached into his satchel. Without saying a word, he placed the old leather ledger on the table. Clara's smile slowly faded. She looked at the worn cover, then at Arthur. "Where did you find this?" Arthur took a slow breath. "Somewhere inside the post office that I never knew existed." For a long moment, Clara didn't speak. Her fingertips rested lightly on the worn leather cover of the ledger, as though she feared it might fall apart if she opened it too quickly. The library around them remained peaceful. A grandfather quietly read a picture book to his grandson in the children's corner. Rain tapped gently against the tall windows. Somewhere deeper inside the building, the old heating pipes let out a soft creak. Everything felt ordinary. Only the ledger on the table did not. Clara finally looked up. "You said you found this inside the post office?" Arthur nodded. "In a room hidden behind an old bookshelf." Her eyes widened slightly. "A hidden room?" Arthur smiled. "I know how that sounds." "No," Clara replied thoughtfully. "It's just, I've spent years studying this town's history. I've read old maps, building records, even newspaper archives." She paused. "And I've never seen any mention of a hidden room." Arthur gently slid the ledger toward her. "Neither had I." Clara opened the first page with great care. The handwriting was remarkably elegant. Every date, every address, every name, written with quiet precision. She turned another page, then another. The entries stretched across decades. Finally, she reached the last page. Arthur watched silently as she read the final sentence. Some letters arrive exactly when they are needed, not when they are written. She read it again, then closed the book. I don't think William Ashcroft wrote this as a postal instruction. Arthur leaned forward. What do you mean? It sounds more like... She searched for the right word. Belief. Arthur had been thinking the same thing. William Ashcroft had been a postmaster. Postal workers dealt with schedules, routes, addresses, and rules. Not mysterious messages. Yet that single sentence felt deeply personal, almost like advice left for someone he knew would come many years later. Arthur smiled at the thought. If that's true. He was very patient. Clara laughed softly. Very. She stood and walked toward one of the oldest shelves in the library. Most visitors never noticed it. The books there weren't novels or travel guides. They were local records, town council minutes, property maps, church documents, census books, the quiet history of Maple Hollow. After several minutes, Clara returned carrying a thick volume bound in faded green cloth. She laid it gently on the table. Founding Records of Maple Hollow. Arthur had seen the book before, but had never opened it. Clara carefully turned the pages until she stopped at a hand-drawn map dated 1917. This, she said, pointing to the page, is the original town centre. Arthur leaned closer. The streets looked familiar. The river, the church, the town square. Most had changed very little over the last century. Then Clara pointed toward a small note beside the post office. Arthur narrowed his eyes. The handwriting was tiny. Beneath the sketch of the building were the words, "Records Vault, lower level." Arthur looked at her. So someone knew. Clara nodded slowly. Apparently. But somewhere along the way, everyone forgot. For several minutes they studied the map in silence. Eventually Arthur asked, "Do we know anything about William Ashcroft?" Clara smiled. Very little. She walked to another shelf and returned with a worn scrapbook filled with newspaper clippings. Most of the pages had faded with age. One photograph caught Arthur's attention immediately. A black and white picture of the Maple Hollow post office. Standing proudly in front of it was a younger William Ashcroft. Tall, neatly dressed, a calm expression on his face. Arthur recognized something instantly. He smiles the same way. Clara looked puzzled. As who? Arthur chuckled. As every postmaster I've ever known. Beneath the photograph was a newspaper article. The headline read, "Local postmaster honored for 30 years of service." Arthur scanned the article. It described William as honest, dependable, and deeply respected throughout the county. One sentence stood out. He believed every letter carried more than words. It carried a piece of someone's life. Arthur slowly lowered the newspaper. He whispered almost to himself, "I've believed that my whole career." Clara smiled. "Maybe you have more in common with him than you realize." Arthur looked out the library window. The rain had stopped. Sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the maple trees outside. Golden leaves drifted slowly onto the sidewalk. He couldn't explain why, but he felt as though William Ashcroft had been trying to leave behind more than records, more than letters. Perhaps a responsibility. Clara noticed Arthur's thoughtful expression. "You're thinking about opening one of the letters?" Arthur didn't answer immediately. Finally he nodded. Yes, but not out of curiosity. He paused. I want to understand why they were never delivered. Clara folded her hands. If you do, promise me one thing. Arthur looked at her. Don't treat them like old documents. Treat them like people's lives. Arthur smiled gently. I don't think I could do anything else. As Arthur gathered the ledger and carefully placed it back into his satchel, something slipped from between its final pages. A small, yellowed card drifted onto the table. Neither of them had seen it before. Clara picked it up. There were only 3 handwritten words. No signature, no date. Just a quiet instruction. Begin with Eleanor. Arthur's heart skipped. Eleanor Pierce. The very first name he had noticed on the bundle of forgotten letters. He looked at Clara. She looked back at him. She looked back at him. Neither needed to say a word. For the first time since discovering the hidden room, Arthur knew exactly where to begin. Arthur held the small, yellowed card between his fingers. 3 words. Begin with Eleanor. Nothing more. No signature. No explanation. Yet those 3 words felt strangely deliberate, as though they had been written for the person who would one day discover the hidden room. Clara looked thoughtfully at the card. That wasn't inside the ledger when I first opened it. Arthur nodded. I didn't see it either. It must have been tucked between the last pages all these years. For a moment, neither of them tried to explain it. There was probably a simple reason. Old paper shifted. Loose pages slipped free. Still, the timing was remarkable. Arthur carefully placed the card inside the ledger before closing it. I'm not going to open Eleanor's letter, he said. Clara looked surprised. I thought you planned to. So did I. He smiled gently. But the envelope belongs to her family, not to me. Clara's expression softened. I was hoping you'd say that. Arthur believed letters deserved privacy, even after many years. If he was going to deliver them, he wanted to honor the trust of the people who had written them. The afternoon passed quietly. Before returning to the post office, Arthur stopped at the town archives, a small room attached to the library where property records and family histories were stored. Clara unlocked the cabinet marked Residence, Historical Records. She pulled out a drawer labeled P. Here we are, she said. Pierce, Eleanor. Arthur read the faded card. Born, 1919. Passed away, 1988. Last known address, 18 Maple Street. He looked up. The same address on the envelope. Clara nodded. According to this, the house is still standing. Does anyone live there now? She checked another file. Yes. She smiled. Her granddaughter. Arthur looked thoughtful. So the house never left the family. As they closed the cabinet, Clara said quietly, Arthur, there's something you should know. He turned toward her. Eleanor was one of the people who helped keep this town together. How? She organized community dinners, wrote letters for neighbors who couldn't write, and volunteered at the church for decades. Arthur smiled. I wish I'd known her. You probably would have liked her. The walk back to the post office felt different. The mystery was no longer about hidden rooms or forgotten ledgers. Now it had a face. A real person. Someone who had once walked the same streets. Someone who had waited for a letter that never arrived. Arthur wondered how many times Eleanor had looked toward the mailbox, hoping the next delivery might bring something important. Perhaps she had waited for weeks, perhaps months, or perhaps she had eventually stopped waiting altogether. The thought weighed heavily on him. When Arthur reached the post office, Noah was finishing the day's deliveries. "You found something, didn't you?" Noah asked as soon as he saw him. Arthur smiled. "We found a name. Eleanor Pierce." Arthur looked surprised. "How did you know?" "You kept saying it last night." Arthur laughed softly. "I suppose I did." Noah leaned against the sorting table. "So what's next?" Arthur walked to the back office and unlocked the cabinet where he had placed the forgotten mail sack that morning. He untied the faded ribbon. Carefully, he removed Eleanor's envelope. The paper felt surprisingly strong, despite its age. He turned it over once more. The sentence on the back was still there. "Deliver when the time is right." Noah read it silently. "Do you think—" He hesitated. "This is the right time?" Arthur looked at the envelope for several seconds. Then he nodded. "I believe it is." He searched one of the drawers beneath the counter and took out a fresh archival envelope. Without opening the original letter, he placed it gently inside for protection. Noah watched every movement. "You've done this before." Arthur smiled. "Not with a letter this old, but with things that mattered." The old wall clock struck 5. Outside, the streets of Maple Hollow were growing quieter. People were heading home. Shopkeepers were turning their signs to closed. Golden evening light stretched across the town square. Arthur put on his coat. Noah looked at him. "You're leaving now?" Arthur nodded. "If I wait until tomorrow, I might lose the courage." He slipped the protected envelope into the inside pocket of his coat. For the first time in decades, Arthur walked out of the post office carrying a letter unlike any he had ever delivered. Not because it was old, but because no one knew what it contained. As he locked the front door, the bronze bell above it rang once. The familiar sound echoed across the quiet street. Arthur paused on the steps. Across the square, Maple Street disappeared beneath rows of brilliant red and golden maple trees. Somewhere along that peaceful street stood number 18, a house that had quietly held on to one family's memories for generations. Arthur took a slow breath and started walking. He didn't know whether the people living there would welcome him. He didn't know whether the letter would bring joy, sadness, or simply unanswered questions. But after waiting in silence for so many years, it was finally on its way home. On its way home, Arthur walked at an unhurried pace. The streets of Maple Hollow were wrapped in the quiet glow of late afternoon. Golden leaves drifted lazily from the maple trees, and a cool breeze carried the faint scent of cedar and chimney smoke. He had walked these streets thousands of times, yet this evening felt different. Inside his coat rested a letter that had remained undelivered for decades. Every few steps, Arthur instinctively touched the inside pocket, making sure it was still there. Not because he feared losing it, because he understood its weight. It wasn't heavy in his hands. It was heavy with time. Maple Street curved gently along the northern side of town. Most of the houses had wide front porches, white fences, and gardens that were now painted with the colors of autumn. Arthur slowed as he reached number 18. It was a charming white farmhouse with green shutters. A large maple tree stood proudly in the front yard, its branches stretching over the roof like protective arms. The house looked well cared for. Someone clearly loved this place. Arthur climbed the 3 wooden steps to the porch. For a brief moment, he hesitated. He had delivered thousands of letters in his life. Yet he had never felt nervous about knocking on a door. Today was different. He wasn't simply delivering mail. He was delivering a piece of the past. He knocked gently. A few moments later, footsteps approached. The front door opened. Standing before him was a woman in her early 50s. She wore a soft blue sweater, and silver strands had begun to appear in her dark hair. Her expression was warm but curious. "Good evening." Arthur smiled politely. "Good evening. I'm Arthur Bell from the Maple Hollow Post Office." Her face brightened immediately. "Of course. I know who you are. My grandmother always spoke very highly of you." Arthur paused. "Your grandmother?" She nodded. "Eleanor Pierce." Arthur's heart sank for a moment. "So, you are her granddaughter." "My name is Sarah Pierce." Arthur smiled gently. "It's nice to meet you, Sarah." She opened the door a little wider. "Would you like to come in?" The house felt peaceful. Family photographs lined the hallway. An old grandfather clock ticked steadily in the corner. Everything carried the quiet warmth of a home that had been lived in for generations. Sarah led Arthur into the sitting room. "I'll make some tea." Arthur shook his head with a smile. "Only if it's not any trouble." "It never is." While Sarah prepared the tea, Arthur looked around the room. Above the fireplace hung a large framed photograph. A young woman stood beneath the same maple tree that still shaded the front yard. Arthur recognized her instantly. Eleanor Pierce. She was smiling at the camera, holding a basket filled with freshly picked apples. Arthur had never met her. Yet somehow, the photograph made her feel familiar. Sarah returned carrying 2 cups of tea. She noticed Arthur looking at the photograph. She loved that tree. Arthur smiled. It seems the tree loved her too. Sarah laughed softly. It still drops far too many leaves every autumn. For a few moments, they spoke about ordinary things. The weather, the harvest festival, the changing season. Arthur didn't want to rush. Some conversations deserved patience. Finally, he reached into his coat. He placed the protected envelope carefully on the coffee table. Sarah looked down. Her smile slowly faded. "What is this?" Arthur answered quietly. "I found it inside the old post office. It was never delivered." Sarah stared at the yellowed envelope. She didn't touch it. "Not yet. It's addressed to my grandmother." Arthur nodded. "I believe it waited a very long time." Sarah remained silent. Then she asked the question Arthur had expected. "Did you read it?" Arthur met her eyes. "No. It isn't mine to read." A look of relief crossed Sarah's face. "Thank you." She picked up the envelope with both hands. Her fingers trembled slightly. Not from fear, from emotion. She studied the handwriting carefully. Then something caught her attention. She leaned closer. "I know this handwriting." Arthur looked surprised. "You do?" Sarah nodded slowly. "I've seen it before." She stood and walked toward an old oak cabinet beside the fireplace. After opening one of its drawers, she removed a small wooden box. Inside were dozens of neatly tied letters, family correspondence, holiday cards, old photographs. She searched carefully until she found a single envelope. Then she placed it beside the newly discovered one. Arthur compared them. The handwriting was nearly identical. Sarah whispered, "They were written by the same person." Arthur looked at the older envelope. "Who?" Sarah took a slow breath. "My great-grandfather." She looked back at the unopened letter. "He passed away before I was born." Arthur's thoughts raced. If her great-grandfather had written this letter, then it had remained undelivered for more than half a century. The room grew quiet again. Outside, evening settled over Maple Hollow. The wind gently stirred the branches of the old maple tree. Neither Arthur nor Sarah realized it yet. But that unopened envelope was about to reveal the first thread in a story that had remained unfinished for generations. The morning after returning from the old railway station, Arthur Bell unlocked the Maple Hollow post office with a different sense of purpose. Only 2 days remained before his retirement. For 45 years, every morning had begun the same way. He unlocked the front door, sorted the incoming mail, greeted familiar faces, and watched the town slowly wake up. But those routines no longer felt ordinary. Now, every sunrise brought another unfinished story waiting to be completed. Arthur walked into his office and placed William Ashcroft's second ledger on the desk. Beside it rested the canvas mail pouch they had recovered from the abandoned railway station. Inside were only 3 envelopes. William had numbered them himself, 345. Arthur carefully lifted the first one. The envelope was addressed to Miss Emily Carter. Unlike the previous letters, this envelope felt slightly thicker. Arthur turned it over. The familiar sentence appeared once again. "Deliver when the time is right." He smiled quietly. So this is our next journey. Noah arrived a few minutes later, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "I guessed you'd already be here." Arthur accepted one with a grateful smile. "I couldn't sleep much." Thinking about the next letter, Arthur nodded. "The more I learn about William, the more I realize he wasn't preserving paper. He was preserving moments." Noah looked at the envelope. "Who's next?" "Emily Carter." Noah frowned. "The retired nurse?" Arthur looked surprised. "You know her?" "Everyone does. She spent almost 40 years at Maple Hollow Community Hospital." Arthur smiled. "I've delivered her mail for decades. But I know very little about her." Arthur opened William's ledger. Only one note appeared beneath Emily Carter's name. "The greatest kindness is often the one no one remembers receiving." No address, no explanation. Only those words. Arthur closed the book. William never gives answers. He only points the way. Before visiting Emily, Arthur stopped at the public library. Clara Bennett was already waiting. "I had a feeling you'd come." Arthur showed her the envelope. She studied the handwriting for a moment. Then she quietly walked toward the archive shelves. After several minutes, she returned, carrying a thin newspaper file. "Emily Carter," she said. "I found 3 articles." Arthur sat beside her. The first article celebrated Emily's graduation from nursing school. The second praised her bravery during a severe winter storm, when she remained at the hospital for 3 straight days treating injured residents. The third was different. There was no photograph, only a short announcement. "Local farmer donates anonymous scholarship." Arthur looked puzzled. "What does this have to do with Emily?" Clara smiled. "Read the last paragraph." Arthur read carefully. The scholarship had paid the full tuition of 1 local student. The recipient's name had never been made public. "No one ever discovered who received it," Clara said. Arthur closed the newspaper. For a brief moment, he looked at the envelope again. Then at William's note. "The greatest kindness is often the one no one remembers receiving." He quietly slipped the newspaper into his satchel. "I think these 2 are connected." The road to Emily's cottage followed the Maple River. Autumn had transformed the landscape into shades of gold and crimson. Arthur walked slowly. Not because the journey was long, because he had learned something important. Every delivery deserved patience. When he reached the small white cottage overlooking the river, Emily was tending to a garden of late-blooming roses. She looked up and smiled. "Arthur, I was wondering when I'd see you." Arthur smiled back. "I've brought something that belongs to you." Emily wiped the soil from her hands before accepting the envelope. The moment she recognized the handwriting, her expression changed. Her smile faded into quiet surprise. She whispered one name. "Michael?" Arthur heard it clearly. "Was that the sender?" Emily nodded slowly. "My older brother." She gently ran her fingers across the faded ink. "I haven't seen his handwriting in over 50 years. Arthur remained silent. He had learned not to interrupt moments like this. Emily looked toward the river for a long time before speaking again. "My brother left Maple Hollow when I was 18. He promised he'd come back. But life became busy. Letters became fewer. And eventually, they stopped." Arthur asked softly. "Did you ever know why?" Emily looked down at the envelope. "I thought I did. But now, I'm not sure anymore." She carefully broke the old seal. The paper inside unfolded with a faint rustle. Emily read the first few lines. Almost immediately, tears gathered in her eyes. Arthur didn't ask what the letter said. He simply waited. Because some stories were meant to be told by the people who had lived them. Emily lowered the letter onto the table. She didn't speak immediately. Arthur noticed that she wasn't crying because of sadness alone. There was relief in her eyes, the kind that comes after carrying the same misunderstanding for many years. Finally, she looked at him. "I spent half my life believing my brother forgot about me." She gently touched the faded paper. "He never did." Arthur remained quiet. He knew the letter belonged to Emily's story, not his. Emily read one passage aloud. "If you're reading this, it means William believed the time was right. I asked him to keep this letter until you had already built the life you dreamed of. I never wanted my help to become the reason you doubted your own strength." Arthur slowly looked up. The words explained everything. The letter hadn't been delayed by accident. It had been entrusted to William Ashcroft. Emily smiled faintly. "When I wanted to study nursing, we had almost no money. I was ready to give up." Arthur remembered the newspaper clipping Clara had found. The anonymous scholarship. Emily nodded. "I always believed it came from a local charity." She unfolded another sheet that had been tucked behind the letter. It was a receipt from the Maple Hollow Bank. The amount matched the full cost of her first year at nursing school. At the bottom was one handwritten sentence. "Use this for Emily's future. She must never know it came from me." Signed, Michael Carter Emily closed her eyes. So it was him. Arthur understood why William had waited. If Emily had learned the truth as a young woman, she might have abandoned her dream to repay her brother. Instead, she had completed her studies, served the town for nearly 40 years, and helped thousands of patients. The truth no longer carried guilt, only gratitude. William had judged the moment well. Emily stood and walked to a bookshelf near the fireplace. From the top shelf, she took down an old photo album. She opened it to a page where 2 children stood beside the Maple River, laughing as they held homemade fishing rods. "My brother was 12. I was 7. Arthur smiled. "You look happy." "We were." She traced Michael's face with her finger. "He always believed my future would be brighter than his." Emily turned another page. Inside the album was a folded postcard. I've never understood why I kept this. She handed it to Arthur. It was addressed to William Ashcroft. On the back, Michael had written only one sentence. "Thank you for promising me. You'll know when she's ready." Arthur looked at the familiar handwriting. This was the second time he had seen someone place such complete trust in William. He carefully returned the postcard. He carried more than letters. Emily nodded. He carried promises. As Arthur prepared to leave, Emily stopped him. "There's one more thing." She opened a small wooden drawer and removed a brass name badge. The lettering had faded, but it was still readable. Michael Carter Maple Hollow Railway Mail Service. Arthur looked at it in surprise. He worked with the railway. For a short time. Emily smiled. He often said William Ashcroft taught him that delivering mail wasn't about envelopes. It was about people. Arthur slipped the words into his memory. Every family he visited revealed another piece of the same man. Not through grand speeches, but through small acts of kindness that had quietly shaped lives across the town. Arthur walked back toward the post office as the afternoon sun settled over Maple Hollow. Inside his satchel were copies of the bank receipt and the postcard Emily had allowed him to borrow. Neither was another mystery. They were evidence that William's decisions had never been random. Back at his desk, Arthur placed the documents beside the ledger. He drew a careful line beneath Emily Carter. 3 letters had now found their owners. 3 families had found peace. Arthur turned the page. Below the number 4, another name waited. Samuel Brooks. Beside it, William had written one final sentence. This letter was never meant to change the past, only the future. Arthur closed the ledger. Tomorrow's journey would be different. Not because the next letter was older, but because for the first time, its destination was someone who still believed there was nothing left to forgive. Arthur arrived at the post office just before sunrise. The town was still quiet. He placed Emily Carter's letter, the bank receipt, and Michael's postcard into separate archival folders before returning them to the railway ledger. William Ashcroft had preserved every document with care, and Arthur intended to do the same. As he closed the folder, Noah entered through the front door. "I heard you visited Emily yesterday." Arthur smiled. "I did." "And?" Arthur looked toward the window. "She didn't receive money. She received peace." Noah nodded. "I think that's what these letters are really delivering." The morning passed quickly. When the last customer left, Arthur unlocked the drawer containing the remaining envelopes. Only 2 were left. Number 4, Samuel Brooks. Number 5, Grace Turner. Arthur picked up Samuel Brooks's envelope. Unlike the others, it felt unusually light, almost empty. He turned it over. The familiar sentence was still there. "Deliver when the time is right." But beneath it, written in smaller handwriting, was something he hadn't noticed before. "Do not explain this letter. Let it speak for itself." Arthur immediately recognized William's writing. He slipped the envelope back into his satchel. This one would require no preparation. Only delivery. Before leaving, Arthur stopped by the library. Clara was sorting donated books. "I won't need the archives today," Arthur said. She looked surprised. "No clues?" Arthur smiled. William already left one. He showed her the note on the back of the envelope. Clara read it and quietly nodded. "Then don't search for answers before the letter reaches its owner." Arthur agreed. Some stories didn't need research. They only needed the right moment. Samuel Brooks lived on the eastern edge of Maple Hollow. His small farmhouse overlooked wide fields of corn that had already been harvested for the season. Arthur found Samuel repairing an old wooden fence. Though well into his 70s, his hands still moved with the confidence of a lifelong farmer. He looked up as Arthur approached. "I wasn't expecting mail today." Arthur smiled. "Neither was I." He held out the envelope. "I believe this belongs to you." Samuel wiped his hands before accepting it. The moment he saw the handwriting, he grew silent. "I know this writing." Arthur waited. "My father," Samuel whispered. "He wrote very little." Samuel invited Arthur onto the porch. Without saying another word, he opened the envelope. Arthur noticed that there was only a single sheet of paper inside. No photograph, no receipt, no second document. Samuel read the letter once. Then he quietly read it again. When he finished, he folded it with remarkable care. Arthur finally asked, "Would you like to tell me what it says?" Samuel smiled gently. "There isn't much to tell." He handed the letter to Arthur. "It only has 4 sentences." Arthur hesitated. "I shouldn't," Samuel interrupted him. "My father wanted someone else to read it to." Arthur looked at the page. It read, "Samuel, if you're reading this, then William kept his promise. I was proud of you every single day, even when I forgot to say the words aloud. Please don't spend your life believing my silence meant anything else." Arthur lowered the letter. No long explanation. No hidden secret. Only 4 simple sentences. Yet they carried the weight of an entire lifetime. Samuel looked across the empty fields. My father wasn't an unkind man. He simply believed feelings should be shown through work. Arthur nodded. Many people from his generation did. Samuel smiled. I spent 50 years wishing he'd said he was proud of me. He looked back at the letter. It turns out he already had. Arthur understood William's final instruction. Do not explain this letter. Let it speak for itself. There was nothing to add, nothing to solve. Sometimes the shortest message carried the deepest meaning. As Arthur prepared to leave, Samuel carefully placed the letter inside the pocket of his old work jacket. I'm going to keep this with me, he said. So, every morning, before I walk into these fields, I'll remember the words I waited a lifetime to hear. Arthur smiled. Another letter had found its owner, and another quiet burden had finally been lifted. Arthur left the Brooks farmhouse just as the afternoon sun settled over the fields. The visit had been different from the others. There had been no family mystery, no forgotten accident, no hidden document. Just 4 simple sentences that had changed the way a son remembered his father. As he walked back toward town, Arthur thought about William Ashcroft's note. Do not explain this letter. Let it speak for itself. For the first time, Arthur realized that not every letter had been preserved because it contained a secret. Some had been preserved because their words needed the right moment to be heard. Back at the post office, Noah was finishing the day's deliveries. How did it go? He asked. Arthur smiled. It was the shortest letter I've delivered. And it may have meant the most. Noah laughed softly. I think I'm beginning to understand, William. Arthur looked at the old hallway leading toward the hidden room. So am I. That evening, Arthur updated William's ledger. He drew a careful line beneath Samuel Brooks. Next to the name, he added only 1 sentence. Delivered. Peace restored. He paused before closing the book. For a moment, he wondered if William had written similar notes after every completed delivery. Perhaps another ledger existed somewhere, or perhaps he had simply carried those memories in his heart. Just as Arthur was about to lock the office, Clara arrived. "I thought you'd still be here," Arthur smiled. "I usually am." She noticed the open ledger. "So Samuel's letter has finally been delivered." Arthur nodded. "It reminded me that silence can last longer than words." Clara placed a folded newspaper on the desk. "I found this while organizing the archives." Arthur looked at the date. It was more than 50 years old. Across the top was a photograph of William Ashcroft receiving an award for 30 years of service. Arthur had seen the photograph before, but today something else caught his eye. Standing beside William was a young woman wearing a railway mail uniform. She wasn't identified in the article. Arthur pointed to her. "Do you know who she is?" Clara shook her head. "The article doesn't mention her." Arthur turned the page over. Someone had written a single name in pencil. Grace Turner. Arthur looked at the remaining envelope resting inside his desk drawer. It was addressed to Grace Turner. The final letter. The next morning, Arthur opened the drawer and carefully lifted the envelope. It was noticeably thicker than the others. As he examined it, something slipped from inside the protective folder. A small railway ticket, unused. Its destination read, Maple Hollow to Ashford Junction. On the back, William had written one sentence. "Some journeys begin only after the last letter is delivered." Arthur held the ticket for a long moment. He didn't yet understand what it meant. But after everything he had witnessed over the past few days, he had learned not to dismiss William's words. Every note, every envelope, every promise. They all revealed their meaning in time. Arthur placed the ticket back into the folder and looked out through the post office window. Only one letter remained. Yet he had the feeling that delivering it wouldn't be the end of the story. It would be the beginning of William Ashcroft's own. 3 days remained before Arthur Bell's retirement. For most people, those days would have been filled with farewells, speeches, and memories. For Arthur, they carried something far more important. One unopened letter, one unfinished promise. That morning, he unlocked William Ashcroft's second ledger and turned to the page marked with the number 4. At the top was a familiar name, Samuel Brooks. Below it, William had written a longer note than usual. "This letter contains no mystery. It contains something far rarer. Deliver it exactly as it is. Add nothing. Explain nothing." Arthur read the sentence twice before closing the book. He understood William's instruction. Some truths became weaker when someone else tried to explain them. Before leaving the post office, Arthur met Noah in the sorting room. Noah noticed the envelope in Arthur's hand. "So, this is the 4th one." Arthur nodded. "It may be the simplest. And sometimes the simplest is the hardest." Arthur smiled. "I think William would agree." Noah hesitated before asking, "Have you ever wondered why William chose you?" Arthur looked surprised. "I've asked myself that every day. And? I don't think he chose me because I was the best postmaster." Arthur looked around the quiet building. "I think he chose me because I never opened a letter that wasn't mine." Noah smiled. "Trust." Arthur nodded. "That's what all of this has been built on." Samuel Brooks lived on the eastern farmland, nearly 2 miles outside Maple Hollow. Arthur had delivered mail there for decades. He knew every bend in the dirt road, every oak tree that lined the fences, every field Samuel had planted. When Arthur arrived, Samuel was repairing an old wooden gate. He greeted Arthur with the easy smile of someone who had known him for years. "You've never visited without a mailbag." Arthur lifted the envelope. "Today I only needed one letter." Samuel looked at the handwriting. His expression changed immediately. For a long moment, he said nothing. Finally, he whispered, "My father's writing." Arthur quietly handed him the envelope. Neither man spoke again until they reached the farmhouse porch. Samuel carefully broke the seal. Inside was only a single sheet of paper. No photographs, no documents, no explanation. Just a letter. Samuel began to read. Within seconds, his weathered hands began to tremble. Arthur looked away, giving him the privacy the moment deserved. After nearly a minute, Samuel folded the paper again. He drew a slow breath and looked toward the endless fields stretching beyond the farmhouse. "My father wrote only 4 sentences." He smiled faintly. "But I spent my whole life waiting to hear them." Samuel remained standing on the porch, the letter still in his hands. For a long while, he said nothing. Arthur didn't interrupt. He had learned that the first conversation, after reading a forgotten letter, was often the most important. Finally, Samuel looked up. "You should read it." Arthur hesitated. "It was written for you." Samuel gave a small smile. "My father wanted someone else to witness these words." He handed Arthur the letter. The paper had yellowed with age, but the handwriting was steady. It read, "Samuel, if this letter has reached you, William has kept the promise I asked of him. A father often believes that hard work speaks louder than words. I believed that for too many years. If I failed to tell you I was proud of the man you became, the failure was mine, not yours. Don't carry my silence any longer." Your father Arthur folded the letter carefully and returned it. There were no dramatic revelations, no hidden inheritance, no family secret. Just a father finally saying what he should have said years earlier. Yet Arthur understood why William had preserved it. Sometimes a few honest words could heal wounds that decades of silence never could. Samuel opened the old wooden chest beside the porch. Inside were family photographs, worn tools, and several notebooks. He removed one of them and handed it to Arthur. "My father kept this journal during his last years." Arthur looked at the faded cover. "Have you read it?" Samuel nodded. "Many times, but something always confused me." He opened to one page. Near the bottom, a single sentence had been underlined. "William says the letter isn't for today." He's probably right. Arthur read it again. "So your father trusted William?" Samuel nodded. "More than anyone." They sat quietly for a while, watching the wind move across the fields. Then Samuel laughed softly. "You know what's strange?" Arthur looked at him. "I spent years wishing my father would apologize." He held up the letter. "But now that I have it, I don't need the apology." Arthur smiled. "What do you need?" Samuel looked toward the old barn. "To stop remembering him for what he never said, and start remembering him for everything he did." Arthur followed his gaze. The farmhouse, the fences, the orchard. Every board and every tree had been built by father and son together. Perhaps those had always been expressions of love. The letter had simply given them words. Before Arthur left, Samuel disappeared into the barn and returned with a small, wrapped package. "This belongs in the post office." Arthur looked surprised. "What is it?" "My father asked me never to open it." He brushed the dust from the lid. He said if William was ever gone, the next postmaster should have it. Arthur carefully accepted the package. A faded label was tied to the string. It read, "For the keeper of the letters." Arthur felt a quiet shiver. William had planned even further ahead than he had imagined. Back at the post office, Arthur placed the package on his desk. No address, no date, no instructions, only the label. Noah looked at it with curiosity. "Are you going to open it?" Arthur slowly shook his head. "Not yet." He opened William's ledger instead. Beneath Samuel Brooks' name, another note appeared. It was the last sentence on the page. "Some gifts must wait until every promise has been kept." Arthur looked at the unopened package, then at the single envelope still resting inside the drawer. Grace Turner. Only one letter remained. Only one promise was still unfinished. Arthur gently closed the ledger. For the first time since discovering the hidden room, he felt that every path William had prepared was leading toward one final destination. And somehow, Arthur knew that the small package on his desk would matter just as much as the last letter. The next morning, Arthur arrived at the post office before anyone else. The small package Samuel had given him was still resting on his desk. He looked at it for several moments before placing it inside the same cabinet that now held William Ashcroft's ledgers. William's final instruction had been clear. Some gifts must wait until every promise has been kept. Arthur had followed William's guidance this far. He wasn't about to ignore it now. A few hours later, Samuel Brooks walked into the post office. His face looked lighter than it had the day before. Arthur smiled. "You seem different." Samuel nodded. "I slept well for the first time in years." Arthur handed him his morning mail. Samuel didn't leave immediately. "There is something I should tell you." Arthur listened. "After you left yesterday, I gathered my children and grandchildren. I read my father's letter aloud." Arthur smiled quietly. "And?" Samuel looked toward the family photographs hanging on the post office wall. "They never knew their great-grandfather. They only knew the stories I told." He paused. "Last night, I told them different stories." Arthur understood. One letter hadn't only changed Samuel's memories. It had changed the memories the next generation would inherit. Before leaving, Samuel handed Arthur an old black-and-white photograph. It showed 3 men standing outside the Maple Hollow post office. One was clearly William Ashcroft. Another was Samuel's father. The third man was unfamiliar. On the back of the photograph, someone had written, "Promises are easier to keep when they are shared." Arthur looked up. "Do you know who the third man is?" Samuel shook his head. "My father never said. But he always kept this photograph in his desk." Arthur carefully placed it inside William's ledger. Another clue. Another piece of a story still waiting to be completed. That afternoon, Clara visited the post office. Arthur showed her the photograph. She studied it for several moments. "I know this face." Arthur looked surprised. "You do?" "I've seen him in the town archives." She thought for a moment. "His name was Edward Turner." Arthur repeated the name quietly. "Turner?" Then he remembered the last unopened envelope. Grace Turner. "Do you think they're related?" Clara nodded slowly. "Edward was Grace's father." Arthur looked again at the photograph. William Ashcroft, Samuel's father. Edward Turner. 3 close friends. 3 men connected by something much deeper than ordinary friendship. Suddenly, the final letter felt even more important. That evening, Arthur opened the second ledger one final time. Only one page remained unread. At the top was written, Grace Turner, below the name. William had written his longest note yet. Arthur read it slowly. The final letter does not end this journey. It explains why the journey began. When Grace receives what belongs to her, open the package Samuel entrusted to you. Only then will every promise be complete. Arthur closed the ledger and looked at the last unopened envelope. He realized something he hadn't understood before. The letters had never been the destination. They had been the path. Each one had led, step by step, toward a single truth that William Ashcroft had protected for decades. Arthur carefully placed Grace Turner's envelope into his leather satchel. Tomorrow would not simply be another delivery. It would be the last letter William Ashcroft had ever chosen to save. And perhaps the most important one of all. The next morning arrived with an unusual calm over Maple Hollow. Arthur stood alone inside the post office, looking at the last envelope resting in his satchel. For several minutes, he simply watched it. Not because he was uncertain, because he knew that once this letter left the post office, William Ashcroft's lifelong mission would be nearing its end. Noah entered quietly. "You're thinking about the last delivery?" Arthur smiled. "I've delivered thousands of letters, but none has felt as important as this one." Noah looked around the old building. "When you retire tomorrow, this place won't be the same." Arthur shook his head. "It will. The building doesn't belong to one postmaster. It belongs to every story that has passed through it." Before leaving, Arthur walked into the hidden room one last time. The shelves that had once held forgotten letters were now almost empty. Only one space remained occupied. The file marked Grace Turner. Arthur removed it carefully. Inside the envelope was a single handwritten letter. Nothing else. No photographs. No receipts. No newspaper clippings. It was the simplest file William had preserved. Arthur smiled. Perhaps the simplest stories matter the most. He locked the room and slipped the key into his pocket. Just before noon, Clara arrived. She carried a thin folder from the town archives. "I found one last record." Arthur opened it. It contained a faded photograph of William Ashcroft standing in front of the post office on the day he retired. Beside him stood 3 people: Edward Turner, Samuel Brooks' father, and a young woman Arthur immediately recognized from the railway photograph, Grace Turner. On the back of the photograph, William had written, "Every promise has a witness." Arthur closed the folder. Everything was connected. Not by coincidence, but by trust. Arthur looked toward the road leading out of town. Grace Turner lived only a few miles away. He picked up his satchel. "This is the last delivery." Clara smiled. "I think William always knew it would be you." Arthur laughed softly. "I hope I prove him right. I prove him right. As Arthur stepped outside, the church bell rang 12 times. He paused for a moment and looked back at the post office. For 45 years, he had entered that building believing his job was to deliver mail. Now he understood it had always been something more. He climbed into his old delivery truck and started the engine. The road curved gently toward the western hills where Grace Turner lived. In the passenger seat lay the final envelope, the last promise, the last journey. Arthur didn't know exactly what awaited him, But for the first time since discovering William Ashcroft's hidden room, he wasn't searching for answers. He was simply delivering the final letter to the person who had been waiting for it the longest. And somewhere beyond the hills, Grace Turner had no idea that the next knock on her door would finally complete a story that had begun more than half a century earlier. The road to Grace Turner's house wound through the western hills, where maple trees cast long shadows across the narrow lane. Arthur had driven this route hundreds of times over the years, but today every mile felt different. Inside his satchel rested the last envelope, the final promise William Ashcroft had protected for more than 50 years. Grace Turner lived in a modest stone cottage overlooking Silver Creek. The garden was carefully maintained, though it was clear she lived alone. Arthur knocked gently. A few moments later, the door opened. Grace smiled politely. "Arthur Bell. I wasn't expecting a delivery today." Arthur returned the smile. "Neither was I." He slowly removed the envelope from his satchel. "I believe this has been waiting for you for a very long time." Grace accepted it with both hands. The moment she saw the handwriting, the color left her face. She whispered only one word. "Father?" Arthur immediately understood. The letter had been written by Edward Turner. Grace invited Arthur inside. The living room was simple but warm. Above the fireplace hung an old black and white photograph of Edward Turner wearing his railway mail uniform. Arthur recognized it instantly. It was the same man from the photograph Samuel had given him. Grace noticed Arthur looking at it. My father believed the railway carried more than passengers. She smiled faintly. He used to say every mailbag carried someone's hope. Arthur replied quietly. William Ashcroft believed the same. Grace looked at him with surprise. They were best friends. She carefully opened the envelope. Unlike the other letters, this one contained 2 folded pages. Grace began reading. Her hands trembled. Halfway through, she stopped and closed her eyes. Arthur remained silent. After a long pause, she continued. When she reached the final line, she quietly folded the letter again. For several moments, she couldn't speak. Finally, she looked at Arthur. My father wasn't writing to say goodbye. Arthur listened carefully. He was asking William to make me one promise. Grace handed Arthur the second page. Near the bottom, Edward had written, William, if life takes me before Grace is ready to understand, keep this letter until the day she no longer blames herself. Arthur frowned gently. Blames herself? Grace nodded. When I was 19, my father left Maple Hollow to take a railway position in another state. She looked toward the old photograph. I believed he left because of an argument we had the night before. Arthur remained quiet. I never forgave myself. Grace unfolded the letter again and read the final paragraph aloud. My dear Grace, you were never the reason I left. I accepted the transfer months before our disagreement. Please don't let one painful evening become the memory that defines our lives. A father's love is always greater than his last conversation. Grace lowered the page. Tears rolled gently down her face. For 52 years, I believed my last words to him were the reason he never came home. Arthur quietly replied, and now you know they never were. Grace nodded. For the first time in more than half a century, the weight she had carried quietly disappeared. Arthur looked at the letter once more. Then he remembered something. William's instruction. When Grace receives what belongs to her, open the package Samuel entrusted to you. The journey was not over. The final letter had found its owner. Now, for the first time, Arthur was about to discover the truth William Ashcroft had never written in any ledger. Grace carefully placed her father's letter back into its envelope. For a long moment, she simply held it against her chest. The silence inside the cottage carried a different feeling now. It was no longer filled with regret. It was filled with acceptance. Arthur stood and prepared to leave. Before he reached the door, Grace called his name. "Arthur?" He turned. "My father asked William to protect this letter." Arthur nodded. "Yes. But William never told me why he trusted him so completely." Grace walked to an old cabinet beside the fireplace and unlocked its bottom drawer. From inside, she removed a small leather notebook. The cover had faded, but one name was still visible: Edward Turner. "My father told me that if someone ever delivered his last letter, this notebook should go to that person." She handed it to Arthur. "I think he meant you." Arthur accepted it carefully. On the first page, Edward had written only one sentence: "If William kept his promise, keep yours. Read only the last page." Arthur smiled. Even now, they're still leaving instructions. Grace laughed softly for the first time that afternoon. My father and William were exactly alike. Arthur turned directly to the final page. There, Edward had written, "The answers you seek were never inside my story. They are inside William's. Open the package Samuel Brooks gave you. Only then will you understand why 5 families were chosen." Arthur slowly closed the notebook. This was the second time he had received the same instruction. There was no longer any doubt. Everything had been leading to that unopened package. Arthur thanked Grace and began the journey back to Maple Hollow. The autumn sun was already setting behind the hills. As he drove, he thought about every family he had visited: Sarah Pierce, Daniel Harper, Emily Carter, Samuel Brooks, Grace Turner. 5 different lives, 5 different letters. Yet every story had carried the same message. Not about loss, not about regret, but about giving people the truth when they were finally ready to receive it. William Ashcroft hadn't simply delivered mail. He had protected hope. When Arthur reached the post office, Noah and Clara were waiting. They had guessed he would return before going home. Arthur placed Grace's letter, Edward's notebook, and Samuel's unopened package on the sorting table. Without saying a word, he showed them the final page of the notebook. Clara read it carefully. "So every clue points here." Arthur nodded. "The package." Noah looked at the faded wrapping. "It has been waiting for years." Arthur untied the old string. Inside the package was a small wooden box. There was no lock, only a folded note resting on top. Arthur unfolded it. The handwriting was unmistakable. William Ashcroft. The note contained only one line: "If every letter has found its owner, tomorrow you will finally learn why I could never throw them away." Arthur looked up. There was nothing else inside the box, only an old brass key resting beneath the note. The key carried a tiny metal tag: Archive Room, Town Hall. Arthur, Clara, and Noah exchanged silent glances. For the first time, the next destination wasn't the post office. It was Maple Hollow Town Hall. And whatever waited inside that archive room, it wasn't another family's story. It was William Ashcroft's. The next morning was Arthur Bell's final day as postmaster. Before the post office opened, he stood alone in the quiet sorting room. For 45 years, this had been the first place he entered every morning. Today, it felt different. The mailbags were lighter. The hidden room was empty. Every forgotten letter had finally reached its owner. Only one mystery remained: William Ashcroft's own. At 9 o'clock, Clara and Noah arrived. Arthur placed the brass key on the counter. "Ready?" Clara smiled. "I've been waiting since you opened the first envelope." The three of them walked across Maple Hollow to the old town hall. The building had changed very little over the decades. Inside, an elderly caretaker greeted Arthur with a warm smile. "I heard today is your last day." Arthur nodded. "It is." The caretaker noticed the brass key. His expression immediately changed. "I haven't seen that key in years." "You recognize it?" The man nodded. "My predecessor told me about it. He said if anyone ever brought that key, they should be taken directly to the archive." Without another question, he led them downstairs. The archive room smelled of old paper and polished wood. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with town records, maps, and handwritten journals. At the far end stood a single oak cabinet. Its lock matched the brass key perfectly. Arthur inserted the key. The lock turned with a soft click. Inside wasn't a box of forgotten letters, nor another ledger. There was only a thick sealed envelope. Across the front, written in William Ashcroft's careful handwriting, were the words, "To the postmaster who finished what I could not." Arthur stared at the envelope. For the first time since this journey began, a letter had been written for him. He slowly broke the seal. Inside was a neatly folded letter. Arthur unfolded it with trembling hands. William's handwriting filled the page. Dear Arthur, if you are reading this, then every letter has found the person who needed it most. That means you have done something I always hoped someone would one day finish." Arthur paused for a moment before continuing. "Many people believed I kept those letters because I couldn't let go of the past. The truth is much simpler. I kept them because I had seen what happened when the truth arrived before people were ready to carry it." Clara quietly wiped a tear from her eye. Arthur continued reading. Some children needed time to grow. Some parents needed time to forgive themselves. Some brothers and sisters needed time to build lives that would not be broken by guilt. The room remained completely silent. William's words explained every decision Arthur had questioned. Near the end of the letter, one final paragraph stood alone. If you have one question left, it is probably this: why these 5 families? The answer is waiting inside the bottom drawer of this cabinet. Arthur lowered the letter. Slowly, he pulled open the drawer. Inside lay 5 small wooden nameplates. Each bore one familiar name: Jonathan Pierce, Thomas Harper, Michael Carter, George Brooks, Edward Turner. Arthur looked at Clara. "They're not the families' names." She nodded. "They're the people who wrote the letters." Arthur picked up the final note lying beneath the nameplates. It read, "These 5 men once saved my life." Arthur froze. For the first time, the mystery was no longer about the letters. It was about William Ashcroft himself. Arthur stared at the note in silence. "These 5 men once saved my life." For several moments, no one spoke. Clara slowly looked at the 5 wooden nameplates. "So, everything began with them?" Arthur nodded. It wasn't coincidence that William kept their letters. He reached into the drawer again. Beneath the nameplates was a thin, leather-bound journal. Unlike the ledgers, it contained no addresses or delivery records. Only one title was written across the cover: My Reason. Arthur carefully opened the first page. The opening entry was dated more than 55 years earlier. William had written, "People often believe a postmaster's greatest duty is delivering letters. They're wrong. Our greatest duty is protecting trust." Arthur turned the page. The next entry described a winter night when a freight train carrying mail had derailed outside Maple Hollow. The accident had trapped William beneath twisted timber and broken mail crates. He had been certain he would not survive. Then help arrived. Not from firefighters, not from the police, but from 5 local men who happened to be nearby. Jonathan Pierce, Thomas Harper, Michael Carter, George Brooks, Edward Turner. Working together through the freezing night, they pulled William free before the wreckage collapsed completely. Clara quietly whispered, "So they really did save his life." Arthur nodded without taking his eyes off the journal. William continued writing. None of them asked for thanks. They simply gathered the scattered mailbags, carried every letter back to the post office, and went home before sunrise. Arthur smiled faintly. Even on the night they had saved a man's life, they had worried about the letters. He understood why William had never forgotten them. The next pages explained something Arthur had never expected. Over the following decades, William watched those 5 friends slowly drift apart. One family suffered a misunderstanding. Another lost contact after tragedy. Others carried guilt, silence, or regret. William had accepted their letters over the years, not because he wanted to keep secrets, but because each writer had asked him the same question in different words. Please don't deliver this until the right time. Arthur closed his eyes for a moment. Every family had trusted William with something deeply personal, and William had never betrayed that trust. Not once. Near the end of the journal was the final entry. The handwriting was weaker than in the earlier pages. William must have written it only a short time before his death. Arthur read it aloud. "If someone is reading these words, then I was right to believe Maple Hollow would one day have another keeper of letters." He continued, "Arthur, if that someone is you, thank you." Arthur stopped. It was the first time William had addressed him by name. He took a slow breath and continued reading. A postmaster does not simply deliver mail. He delivers apologies that arrive too late, forgiveness that waits too long, hope that refuses to disappear. If you have completed these 5 deliveries, then you already understand that. Arthur slowly folded the journal shut. For a long moment, no one moved. The mystery that had begun with a hidden room beneath the post office had finally come full circle. It had never been about forgotten letters. It had always been about a promise made on a cold winter night between 6 ordinary people. Arthur looked at the empty cabinet one last time. There were no more clues to find, no more hidden rooms, no more unopened envelopes. Only one final duty remained. Tomorrow morning, he would hand the keys of the Maple Hollow post office to Noah, and with them, he would pass on something far more valuable than a building. He would pass on the trust that William Ashcroft had protected for a lifetime. The morning sun rose gently over Maple Hollow. For the first time in 45 years, Arthur Bell unlocked the post office, knowing it would be the last morning he would do so as its postmaster. Nothing felt unusual. The familiar scent of polished wood filled the building. The old clock above the sorting room ticked steadily. Outside, the first customers of the day began walking toward the post office. unaware that this ordinary morning would quietly become part of the town's history. Arthur placed William Ashcroft's journal on his desk. Beside it lay the 5 completed delivery records. Every promise had been fulfilled. Every letter had found its owner. Yet one responsibility remained. A small farewell gathering had been arranged for noon. Word had spread through Maple Hollow, and one by one, familiar faces began arriving. Sarah Pierce was the first. She carried a framed photograph of her grandmother, Eleanor. "I wanted this to stay here," she said. "My grandmother believed this post office was part of our family." Arthur accepted it with a smile and placed it on the wall beside the old photographs of former postmasters. A few minutes later, Daniel Harper arrived. He brought a handcrafted wooden letterbox. On its front, he had carved a single sentence: "Every letter has a home." "It belongs here," Daniel said. Arthur ran his hand over the polished wood. "It couldn't have a better place." Emily Carter entered, carrying a bouquet of white lilies from her garden. She looked around the room and smiled. "I've spent 40 years helping people recover. But I never imagined an old letter could heal me." Samuel Brooks arrived soon after. He carried nothing except the letter his father had written. The paper had already been placed inside a protective frame. "I thought I'd leave a copy here," he said. "So people remember that sometimes 4 sentences are enough." Arthur nodded quietly. "They often are." Finally, Grace Turner walked through the door. She paused before speaking. "My father used to say," she smiled toward the old mail counter, "this building kept more promises than any church." Everyone laughed softly. Arthur looked around the room. Only a week earlier, these 5 families had barely known one another. Now they stood together because of a promise one man had kept for more than half a century. At noon, Noah gathered everyone together. He looked toward Arthur. "I prepared a speech." Arthur smiled. "I was afraid you might." The room filled with quiet laughter. Noah folded the paper in his hand. "But I don't think it's necessary." He looked around the room. "Everyone standing here is the speech." No one disagreed. Arthur stepped behind the old wooden counter one final time. He removed the brass key to the hidden room and placed it on the counter. Then he laid William Ashcroft's ledgers beside it. Finally, he added the journal titled My Reason. He turned to Noah. "These don't belong to me." They never did. They belong to the next person willing to protect them. Noah looked at the keys, but didn't pick them up immediately. Instead, he asked, "What if another letter appears someday?" Arthur smiled. "Then don't ask whether it's late. Ask whether it's finally the right time." The room fell silent. Everyone understood those words. They were no longer William Ashcroft's. They had become Arthur Bell's as well. As the afternoon light filled the post office, Arthur stepped outside onto the front porch. He looked across Maple Hollow. Children rode bicycles through the town square. The bakery bell rang as customers came and went. A mail truck slowly disappeared around the corner, beginning another ordinary day's deliveries. Arthur smiled. The town hadn't changed. It simply carried a few less burdens than it had yesterday. He took one last look at the post office before quietly walking down the front steps. His work was finished. But the story of Maple Hollow and the belief that every letter deserves its owner would continue with the next knock on someone's door. The farewell gathering ended as quietly as it had begun. One by one, the townspeople shook Arthur's hand before returning to their daily lives. There were no grand celebrations, no marching band, no newspaper reporters. Arthur preferred it that way. For him, the greatest reward had never been recognition. It had always been the simple words people spoke after receiving a letter. Thank you. That evening, Arthur walked home without carrying a mailbag for the first time in 45 years. The streets of Maple Hollow looked exactly as they had the day before. The bookstore was closing for the night. The bakery owner swept the front steps. Children laughed as they chased one another across the town square. Life moved forward quietly. Arthur smiled. That was exactly how William Ashcroft would have wanted it. The next morning, Noah unlocked the post office alone. It was his first official day as postmaster. He stood for a moment in the empty sorting room before beginning his work. On Arthur's desk sat a small envelope. His name was written neatly across the front. Mr. Noah Collins. There was no stamp, no return address, only Arthur's handwriting. Noah smiled and opened it. Inside was a short note. Dear Noah, if you're reading this, then you've just unlocked the post office for the first time as its keeper. You'll soon discover that most days are wonderfully ordinary. Protect those ordinary days. Because every so often, someone will walk through that door carrying a story instead of a parcel. When that happens, remember what William taught me. Never ask why a letter is late. Ask whether today is finally the right day for it to arrive. Arthur Bell. Noah carefully folded the note. He placed it inside the top drawer of his desk. Not because it was old, but because he already knew he would read it many times in the years ahead. Several weeks later, Clara Bennett visited the post office. She found Noah hanging a new wooden sign beneath the photographs of the former postmasters. It wasn't large, just a single polished plaque made by Daniel Harper. It read, "This post office believes every letter deserves its owner." Clara smiled. I think William would approve. Noah nodded. So would Arthur. That same afternoon, Arthur was sitting on the porch of his cottage, overlooking Maple Hollow. Retirement suited him. He read books, tended a small vegetable garden, and every evening he watched the sunset with a cup of tea. Just before dusk, he heard footsteps on the path. It was Noah. He wasn't carrying a mailbag, only a small package. Arthur laughed. I've only been retired a few weeks. You couldn't stay away? Noah grinned. This one's not for the postmaster. It's for Arthur. Arthur accepted the package. There was no sender's name. Inside was a simple wooden frame. Behind the glass was the photograph of William Ashcroft standing beside the 5 men who had once saved his life. Below it, someone had engraved a single sentence. Some letters arrive in envelopes. The most important ones arrive through people. Arthur looked at Noah. Who made this? Noah smiled. The 5 families. They wanted to thank the man who finished William's promise. Arthur was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked toward Maple Hollow. The post office bell rang in the distance. Someone had just walked through its front door. Another ordinary day had begun. Arthur smiled to himself. Somewhere inside that old brick building, a new story was already waiting. And perhaps, many years from now, another postmaster would discover that the greatest things ever delivered through a post office were never letters alone. They were hope, forgiveness, trust, and the courage to tell someone what mattered before it became too late. The end. Thank you so much for watching until the end.